The pervert trope is a staple in the anime industry. Sexual deviance and kinky taboo is something most anime fans have probably grown accustomed to. Some fans hate it. Others have become desensitized to it, while some other sickos even claim to enjoy it, celebrating the characters who represent these aversive, socially undesirable behaviors. Many argue over the place of pervert characters in fiction. What is their purpose? Do they actually bring anything deeper to a story? And what even is the validity of sexual deviance within a specific narrative? You can tell me your opinions in the comments. I'd actually be curious to read them. But my aim here is not to dictate whether a viewer is allowed to relate to or criticize a character whose surface motivation revolves around touching a woman's breasts, and whether or not being attracted to Hisoka from Hunter x Hunter makes you a morally reprehensible clown fucker. It's beside the point. I'm simply using this pervert trope as an avenue to discuss and dissect one of my own personal favorite pervs in anime and manga. No, not Hisoka, although he's definitely another favorite of mine. My fighter of choice isn't as popular or frequently debated, but one I still love dearly. A super cutie who is woefully misrepresented in the Twitter wars concerning those wicked anime characters that you are in no way, under any circumstances, allowed to be attracted to. Today we will be sticking Golden Kamuy's Tokishige Usami under the microscope and dissecting him bit by bit, hoping, of course, that he doesn't moan too loudly while we're at it. What qualifies as a pervert character? Pervert can mean a lot of things. In my society, it's one thing, in yours, it's another. However, strictly under the lens of manga and anime, it is an archetype for a character, and it usually belies some level of sexual deviance in said character. While sometimes this type is restricted to perving on female characters while they're in the baths, other times the portrayal is explicit, violent, and purposefully scary. While the antics of a two-dimensional perv in a shonen anime rarely do anything for me personally, I believe if a story is well written, even this kind of creepy character can turn out very compelling. As someone who's always enjoyed baddies and weirdos, I unfortunately have come to love several fictional deviants in my time, but few have really touched me as intimately as Usami from Golden Kamuy. I don't think I have to convince those of you familiar with Usami that he is a nasty and moralless pervert, but for the sake of the new kids here, here's a montage of some of Usami's greatest hits. Freaky, isn't he? Now we can finally get to the meat of what makes Usami an interesting, fun, complicated, but still often misunderstood and underappreciated character. Heads up, this video will have spoilers as they pertain to Usami's role in this story, so please keep that in mind. To talk about Usami, we must first establish a bit about the media from which he hails. Those of you who know me know that Golden Kamuy is one of my favorite stories of all times. This is a beautifully drawn, expertly constructed historical action seinen by Satoru Noda. The subjects and themes within the story are deep and multifaceted. The narrative is genuinely beautiful, occasionally horrifying, and full of topics that are relevant in the modern world despite the narrow historical and geographic context. Last but not least, it's chock full of fascinating, woefully human, and psychologically complicated characters. Our subject, Usami, is a side character and a minor antagonist who ultimately has a less dramatic impact on the plot and protagonists of the story. But don't get me wrong, just because he is not at the center of the primary conflict doesn't mean he is any less nuanced and expertly crafted as the rest of the cast members in Golden Kamuy. Usami is the type of character whose beauty exists in the subtext. A character you have to spend some conscious time thinking about to better appreciate. Given the way Usami is, not many people would choose to ruminate on this freak, but for someone like me, it's like a goodie box of potential analysis and what-ifs. As always, my hat goes off to Noda for his skill in character development and ability to insert such a compelling personality for a relatively minor role. Golden Kamuy's greater message is a hopeful and inspirational one, yet it does not shy away from humanity's ugly side. Some darker, reoccurring themes include war, trauma, bloodlust, and yes, deviant sexual desire, and I'd go as far as to say that Usami is far from the only pervert in the story. At large, the unhinged cast has lived through some nightmarish circumstances and now deal with the consequences of these experiences, which have shaped them in diverse ways. However, across good guys and bad guys, in the midst of all these tragic backstories and ranged justifications for deplorable actions, is there, maybe, a character who completely lacks tragedy in his background, growing up twisted just because that's intrinsically who he is? Maybe. Or maybe not. In this cast of unhinged characters willing to stoop to the lowest of the lows, where does Usami lie? Hope you're ready to find out. So who is Usami? Usami is a member of the 7th, a division of the Imperial Army of Japan and a veteran of the Russo-Japanese War. The 7th was a real unit in history, allegedly composed of the toughest soldiers in Japan's military, stationed in the naturally brutal terrain of Hokkaido, and during the Russo-Japanese War were sent out to fight some of the most gruesome battles with the highest mortality counts. Usami, like so many of the other Golden Kamuy bad guys, is a loyal follower of Lieutenant Tsurumi, the primary antagonist of the story. Tsurumi is a rebel lieutenant planning to overthrow the reigning Japanese government. He shares what is basically a cult-like connection with his men, where he is their romanticized leader, a self-proclaimed Shinigami, and the men in his unit are his unflinching executioners. His special ability as a big bad is to gather unhinged misfits under his wing and essentially riz them so hard they become unendingly loyal to him and therefore are ready to commit unspeakable atrocities in his name, if only he should ask. And frankly, for a large portion of the story, there is little more to Usami beyond avid Tsurumi follower. I'd wager that to some readers that's all he remained, but if you don't personally find Usami to be worth the digging, then you might at the very least watch the video of some other obsessed loser who's got it down bad for this freaky weirdo. At the most shallowest of interpretations, Usami is one of Lieutenant Tsurumi's goons. He serves as an example of the power that Tsurumi wields over his followers. He demonstrates the brutal and gruesome nature of what true loyalty to Tsurumi looks like, and he's central to one of Golden Kamuy's most infamous and absurd gags. In my opinion, it's more than enough to enjoy the character, but as it went for me anyway, the closer you look, the more you find there is to love. So let's start unpacking why he is actually so much more than what lies on the surface. There are two themes to pay attention to in Usami's story besides sexuality and violence, and they're laid out in his initial introduction. The themes are subverting expectations and unfinished business. Both are portrayed almost immediately when Usami is introduced. The nature of Usami's twisted personality is kept a secret for about 0.2 seconds of the plot when he first enters the scene as this adorable, seemingly naive, new kid working as a guard in Abashiri prison, a central setting for the early parts of the story. Usami's introduction is one of the best narrative misdirections for a character that I've really come to appreciate, if only because it makes me laugh every time. In Abashiri, he's quickly discovered as a spy for the 7th Division, and the head jailer Katakura is ordered to get rid of him in a seemingly cruel plot, where some of the bloodthirsty criminals in the prison are released to take care of Usami in what's going to be reported as an accident. Seeing it unfold, the reader might pity the cute new kid in his assuredly inevitable death as he is tricked into leaving his katana behind, and the seasoned crooks start to circle him like sharks. The situation begins to dawn on the new kid, and his rising panic is evident. But Usami, ever full of surprises, flips the script and deals with the crooks quite easily, killing them efficiently, turning their own weapons against them without batting an eye, rendering them bloody pulps, before turning a new ominous eye towards the head jailer Karakura who set him up. Karakura and the reader realize together that Usami is actually really strong, and Karakura runs away from Usami, but it leaves their business unresolved, immediately introducing the second important theme that I mentioned, and also setting up a reoccurring gag in the story where whenever Usami senses Karakura nearby, he drops everything he's doing and starts to chase after him like a rabid, ADHD hound dog eager to finish up his hunt. As you can see from his very first scene, Usami has managed to subvert expectations, and the scene concludes with an interrupted confrontation that bothers Usami throughout his entire character arc, and in some ways contributes to his downfall. So what else is Usami like? Before we get into the nasty stuff, I want to highlight some of his other attributes. He has this odd happy-go-lucky type demeanor that contrasts very intensely with the brutal beast we know lurks underneath. He's a fierce brawler who is not easy to beat in hand-to-hand combat. He's resilient. You can see how he takes a kick to the face from the wildly tough Sugimoto the Immortal without even flinching. Usami is impulsive, seemingly acting on a whim to a detrimental extent at times, losing focus at crucial moments. And he's perceptive, seeing through the deceptions of dishonest characters quite easily and oftentimes reading them for filth. He's clever and capable of plotting, manipulating characters to act in a way that he wants for the benefit of his own plots. And of course, Usami is very loyal. He is compared to a dog, and for good reason. And it's not just because of his clearly very active prey drive. He will do anything for Tsurumi, and he will compromise his own self-preservation and dignity for him. More than just a pervert, Usami can be described as violent, dangerous, and unhinged. Although these adjectives just as easily describe the main character and hero of Golden Kamuy, Saichi Sugimoto, someone who is indisputably depicted in a positive light by the narrative. And of course the same words also cover a good chunk of other similarly important characters. However, ask a dedicated fan to pinpoint the worst one among them, and a lot of them might point fingers at Usami. So before I throw a wrench into this perspective, I'd like to explore why that is. A recurring theme in Golden Kamuy speaks on the humanity of men. Does war and murder destroy a man's humanity? Can one do anything to recover this humanness once it's lost? Is there a line into unforgivable evil that can be crossed, and once crossed, is there a way back from it? Many characters in this story search for redemption from the sins of their past, or at the very least, they're searching for belonging despite them. Noda finds a way to shoehorn in some truly demented personalities and still finds ways to humanize them through glimmers of past trauma, shame, and remorse. Even the main antagonist of the story, Lieutenant Tsurumi, expresses subtle hints of this raw human nature, which makes Usami the outlier of the story. Usami's biggest narrative purpose is to demonstrate a killer who completely lacks remorse for his actions. Tsurumi describes him as a natural-born soldier, a dog among the sheep, who is fierce and loyal but feels no regret or shame, aka someone who won't hesitate to kill, not in any context. As this idea is enforced, a fable is told about a farm dog who killed all his owner's chickens, painting a picture of a beast so desperate for his master's attention and love, he doesn't care what means he must stoop to receive it. This symbolic parallel is really emphasized in Usami's backstory as we watch him commit his first murder. At 12 years old, he brutally kills one of his peers. Before this moment, the other boy, Tomoharu, is portrayed to have a friendly relationship with Usami. He sees Usami as a friend and wants to prove himself in Usami's eyes. Outside observers even identify Tomoharu as Usami's best friend. Usami, however, perceives this boy to be a rival for Tsurumi's attention. The feeling of shock when Usami does kill this kid is another major example of subverting expectations in his narrative, and it is amplified further by the atmosphere. Up until this moment, the flashback feels more like a standard boyish coming-of-age story. The events take place in a serene rural farming community, depicting a simplistic life, and by all observations a mostly normal boyhood. Then, the sudden snap into brutal violence is stunning both for readers and the characters observing. This raw moment of unapologetic violence is in such conflict with expectations that even Tsurumi appears utterly bamboozled as he witnesses it. Not for nothing, but if you can make Tsurumi make this face, there is probably something deeply wrong with you, because Tsurumi is not a man who is easily rattled by violence or weirdos. Golden Kamuy fans, I know what some of you are thinking. Hold your horses, Mongoose. That's a younger version of Tsurumi. Maybe he's not as seasoned when it comes to dealing with weirdos yet. And maybe the early interaction with Usami is what made him so unfazed for the weirdos he encounters in the future, because no one is as hardcore as Usami, and nothing following this moment could possibly compare. Yeah, maybe. I honestly think that interpretation has some truth to it, but it also doesn't change the fact that even a younger version of Tsurumi is quick to regain composure, stay cool and collected, and find a way to optimize this massively messed up situation in a way that ultimately enables him to accomplish his goals in the sneakiest way possible. So I'd still wager Usami inspiring this face in Tsurumi is a rare accomplishment despite the relative greenness of this Tsurumi. The point is, in the falling action of Usami's backstory, Tomoharu is dead, and Tsurumi is scheming a way to cover up the murder. Usami does not show a bit of regret. Instead, he looks relieved as Tsurumi placates him, totally blissful to have Tsurumi's full attention and to share such an important secret with him. He is obviously not sorry to have killed this boy. If anything, he seems to be enjoying the aftermath. We will circle back for a closer examination of Usami's backstory later, but first I want to explore the base violence a little deeper. We see more of Usami's brutal philosophy when he grows up, joins the military, and starts interacting with his fellow soldier Ogata. Usami and Ogata are both regarded as weirdos in the army. In this memorable scene, you can see them deliberating the ethics of killing people during a war, with Ogata trying to rationalize his desensitization to death, hypothesizing that it's not weird at all to have a neutral attitude towards murder, while Usami totally gasses him up, acting fully supportive of the idea and purposefully leading Ogata away from a more psychologically healthy conclusion. Don't forget, if you don't want people to judge your life choices, just call up a bitch that's even crazier than you are. While at first glance these silly boys might seem like kindred spirits, two social pariahs bonding over their alternative ways of thinking, they actually clash on multiple levels. Usami usually comes off as cheerful, passionate, and emotive, while Ogata tends to be cold, humorless, and stoic. Ogata has the libido of a dead fish, and Usami is a chronic masturbator. The list goes on, but I'd argue the most important difference between them is that despite Ogata's intense desensitization to violence, he does still feel remorse for these actions deep down. His emotional disassociation from events is just one of many coping mechanisms he's developed over a lifetime to defend his life choices. Usami, on the other hand, simply doesn't feel remorse. It goes beyond lacking guilt for his actions. Usami finds gratification in violence. It gets him off in nearly every context, whether he's the one being brutal or someone is returning the brutality to him. He refers to the places he's killed as holy places, and his method of worship is to pleasure himself while thinking about what's occurred there. It's also implied that he is tempted to recreate his murders as a form of reverence. In this panel here, adult Usami stares eerie-eyed at a dead horse. The idea is that Usami killed this horse in memory of the horse that was blamed for Tomoharu's murder after Tsurumi covered up for Usami's crime many years ago. To protect Usami from the consequences of the murder, what likely would have led to imprisonment and possibly even execution, Tsurumi told everyone that Tomoharu had been kicked to death by his steed instead of one of his peers. This creepy imagery of Usami staring mesmerized at the dead horse is followed shortly by Usami deliberating about a different murderer in the plot, hypothesizing that they are chasing after the sort of pervert that will pleasure himself at the scene of a crime, a kind of pervert that Usami himself is intimately familiar with. This wouldn't be an analysis of anime's best pervert if we didn't talk about how his sexuality plays into all of this. Let's start with the easy stuff. First of all, when it comes to preference of sexual partners, it does not seem like Usami cares much as far as gender is concerned. In fact, I think some people might be tempted to call Usami gay, given how he fawns over Tsurumi, but we've also received hints from Noda that Usami is not a picky eater when it comes to physical pleasure. In fact, Noda made commentary in interviews that Usami would be good at pleasuring women. Yes, you heard it here, folks. Usami fucks women, and he's good at it too. There is also this seriously creepy moment after they hear a murder victim screaming. Usami pinpoints this scream to be a woman's scream. And then he makes this very spooky face while saying it. Make of that what you will, I guess. Beyond that, yeah, he's also clearly super horny for Tsurumi. Please, no one misunderstand me. I am not implying that Usami's apparent pansexuality makes him a pervert, but I do think it's worth noting that he is utterly shameless about it. People familiar with Golden Kamuy know that this narrative does not shy away from flagrant homoeroticism and appreciation of the male form. But despite that, there is something somewhat restrained about the way the other characters navigate these dynamics. In fact, in the conclusion of the infamous Otter Pot wrestling match, where a group of the male characters get high off of an aphrodisiac and play sumo with each other in an attempt to get rid of these insatiable sexual urges, when the effects of the aphrodisiac wear off, everyone avoids eye contact, silently dressing, and swears to never speak of it again, which implies a level of shame. Then you might argue that Tsurumi also just has this effect on his men, and that's certainly true to some extent. But of the other two characters who are similarly passionate and loud in their thirsting for Lieutenant Tsurumi, Edogai and Koito, I'd argue that a lot of this boldness stems from a lack of self-awareness and experience. Before meeting Tsurumi, Edogai lived a very stifled and repressed lifestyle. It's only after Tsurumi intervenes that he feels the confidence to be himself, which ties into his admiration for Tsurumi. Meanwhile, Koito is a silly and oblivious boy. If I'm gonna be honest, I think Koito himself doesn't realize how gay he's being. And we're still working with an element of repression when it comes to this particular dynamic, given Koito gets so worked up in Tsurumi's presence he can't even speak normally to him. Getting so flustered, he switches into his incomprehensible rapid-fire Satsuma dialect. Usami, on the other hand, while a young man, he is still significantly older than many of these other characters. He's also more seasoned than the other guys we just talked about. Experienced, sly, definitely self-aware enough to behave himself when he needs to, and yet utterly shameless when it comes to letting loose. He knows how he comes off when he's hot for Tsurumi. He understands it's a spectacle, and he will do it anyway. Usami's lust is somewhat contradictory to the other more Hemingwayian examples of homoeroticism that exist between other dynamics of the story, like the fellas in Sugimoto's gang, or when Tanigaki spends a few nights hunting in the woods with Nihei, eating blood sausage, making dick jokes, washing each other in the river, normal boy stuff. Again, I repeat, Usami seems very intentional in his queerness, and there is also something more feminine about Usami's nature that contradicts the man's man Hemingway queers in the rest of the cast. His character design reflects traditionally feminine features like pouty lips, beauty marks, and long lashes that give him a doll-like appearance. In the anime, his voice is sweet and soft, adding to this illusion. Kudos to Yoshitsugu Matsuoka, Usami's voice actor, for his amazing performance. So Usami is more or less canonically queer, aware of it, and not ashamed. That does not make him a pervert. Trust me, I know. Please bear with me. What does start sounding more perverted is when you examine some of his more alternative interests within this sexuality. Almost as soon as we meet Usami, we see him get flushed at the thought of Tsurumi punishing him, and we are quick to see the spectacle of how it happens, all hot flesh, deep breaths, and moans, so go ahead and throw a point in the masochism column. And take note of the exhibitionism and voyeurism too. The fact that this punishment takes place in front of the other men is part of the fun for this freaky little deviant. He likes that the others are witnessing Tsurumi giving him this attention, and he likes that they are jealous of him. Usami may seem nonchalant as he explains that the running men Tsurumi drew on his cheeks, those marks of Tsurumi's punishment, were turned into permanent face tattoos. But it's more than just a token of his love for Tsurumi. It's also a reminder to the other jealous men of the connection he'd shared with Tsurumi in the throes of the punishment. Remember the story about the dog who caused trouble for his owner just to get attention? Feels like a relevant thing to keep in mind, given how excited Usami seems to get at the prospects of being punished by Tsurumi. Also, the fact that Usami gets tattoos in such a visible place adds to the social stigma. Face tattoos in most cultures are usually frowned upon, and especially from an ethnic Japanese perspective where tattoos are largely taboo due to their association with the Yakuza. further making this choice by Usami an odd one in just about every context, which relates to how seemingly shameless he is about his sexuality too. But what is masochism without a little sadism? Usami marvels at both sides of this kinky coin, and I don't mean sadism in a contractual, consensual, Christian Grey sort of way or whatever happened in that series. I mean in a holy shit, this psycho is after me, somebody call the police kind of way. As I mentioned before, Usami likes hurting people. He also seems to revel in the hunt of it to some degree. There is that reoccurring gag stemming from Usami's dog-like fixation on chasing the character Katakura around whenever he sees him. Katakura, arguably one of the more normal cast members, does his best to run away from Usami whenever they cross paths. Yet in the instance when Usami does finally corner the poor old man, he traps him in a very predatory way, starts tearing up his clothes, and then starts spanking him while Katakura begs him to stop. True to the pervert trope of anime, this moment is played off as a funny bit in the story, and I have to admit, the sheer absurdity of everything happening here does pull a chuckle out of me personally. But when you really stop to think about the mechanics of this exchange, it is actually obscenely dark, made darker yet when you realize that following this scene, as Usami is running around, you can notice that his pants are unbuttoned. It also comes back to the other theme I pointed out with Katakura, that ever since their introductory moment, Usami chases after Katakura because in his mind, they have unfinished business, and these interrupted confrontations get under Usami's skin and drive him crazy enough to make him lose focus from his greater responsibilities of servicing Lieutenant Tsurumi. This physical build-up seems to be symbolic for sexual frustration or tension, as just thinking about Katakura can make Usami blush. The other character we see this dynamic repeated with is Ogata, who at the end of their friendship insults Usami by calling him Lieutenant Tsurumi's cheapest piece, hitting him over the head with a bedpan and running away from him. In a way that's very similar to his chase of Katakura, Usami has the same disorganized obsessive instinct to chase after Ogata, because in his eyes the confrontation was interrupted by Ogata's escape and they still have a score to settle. So while this spanking confrontation with Katakura is probably the most explicit case of Usami's demented sexual sadism, I can think of at least one other instance of this lust for sexual violence that is mostly buried in the subtext, but it's hard to unsee once you notice it. I believe the setup at the climax of Ogata and Usami's final confrontation is a metaphor for sexual assault. It's all in the gestures and the details as you dissect the pieces of this moment. Usami, who is physically stronger than Ogata and better at close combat, is quick to overpower the other man, bruising him up and knocking him down to the ground. As Ogata crawls away from Usami, Usami towers over Ogata, taunting him menacingly. Some of these insults are even sexual in nature, as Usami references Ogata's mother with derogatory ire. And then there's also Usami's pants, which are still unbuttoned from the Katakura incident, and it flows seamlessly into this extra dark and brutal moment, as Usami shows us his true face, and we see the extent of the danger that lives within him. The very nature of Usami's intent feels carnal as he aims to stab Ogata through the back with his bayonet. I challenge you to come up with your own conclusion on what that might be symbolism for. Knowing what we know about Usami, it's not difficult to make the leap from traditional violence to an even more sinister direction. The cherry on top of this twisted sundae of course happens as Ogata uses his tongue to load his weapon in a scene commonly regarded as his most sexy moment by many Ogata simps. And yet, I can't help tying it into this predatory setup, where Usami acts out his merciless violent abuse, and Ogata, even if just for a second, is forced into this submissive role where he is bloody, crawling on the ground belly down, trying to get away from Usami. As Ogata loads his gun, the imagery is notably erotic. His tongue glistens, and he engages with the inanimate object in a very peculiar fashion, while Usami casts this domineering shadow over him. To me, this feels very intentional, but if you disagree, that's of course fair. I'd encourage you to leave me a comment on the differing interpretations of what you think this scene represents. Anyway, saving the best for last in this section, my final point is of course going to be about the semen fight, where, yes, Usami participated in a jack-off showdown with none other than Jack the Ripper, another infamous serial killer whose bloodlust was deeply tied to twisted sexual deviance. Usami's sexuality is so ingrained with violence that he is even able to profile a murderer by touching himself at the scene of his crimes. In these moments, he is fully climbing into the shoes of a murderous pervert and pleasuring himself at these so-called holy places to get a better understanding of his thought process, becoming the infamous semen detective in doing so. Not only is he completely casual, yanking it in front of another soldier, even carrying on conversation in the middle of the process, but this secret actually leads them to the suspect where they do all this. I'd like to take a moment to point out how serious Usami is during the semen detective debut. Despite the absurdity of the situation, he's 100% meaning business, telling Kikuta, his partner on the scene, to shut up and stop distracting him. Then, what follows this infamous gag? An interesting conversation where Usami deliberates over Ogata's psychological weakness as compared to his own. It almost feels like venting as he continues to touch himself as he describes his past with Ogata, his frustration with the unresolved tension between them, emphasized further when he talks about Ogata's remorse in killing his younger brother Yusaku. In a phrase specific to the anime translation, Usami even says that Ogata gave himself permanent blue balls because he was unable to tarnish Yusaku's purity before he died. Peculiar phrasing that emphasizes the idea of sexual frustration that Usami apparently relates to his feelings of unfinished business, and also further ties in Usami's perspective on sex and murder. So now that I've hopefully convinced you that Usami is a creepy, gross, and depraved pervert undeserving of sympathy, it's time for me to explain why he's actually just a little guy. The thing is, I find Usami to be quite tragic. The interesting part of his character lies in the fact that he is also a form of victim himself, which means the unhinged violence that is so trademark of Usami is a byproduct of the grooming he faced as a child, which establishes a cycle of victimization given what he grows into as an adult. It's interesting that Noda chooses to show us Usami as a child at all, letting us see him before he was a murderer, still with a youthful sparkle in his eyes, that much like the other key 7th Division members he loses as an adult, and before his perversion becomes more apparent. Whenever a child is depicted in Golden Kamuy, they tend to carry with them a level of innocence. Their fates are still malleable, and it's kind of a big deal to the plot. What with Ashirpa as the youngest central cast member and the large emphasis on her virtuous status, which is tied to her refusal to kill, serving sharp contrast to the grisly war veteran characters with blood-soaked pasts. The innocent depiction of children is true even for Usami. Look how cute he is pre-murder. So adorable, right? Seeing as subtext is so important to understanding Usami, shall we take a closer examination of his backstory? Usami is shown to come from a lower-class farming family. He is one of many children, and by all observation seems to come from a healthy family unit. It's important to note, as a lot of the more damaged characters are shown to have had a bad home life. For instance, Tsukishima's father was a murderous drunk who abused him. Ogata was abandoned by his father and neglected by his mentally unwell mother. Even Koito grew up very lonely, gossiped about by townspeople, and neglected by his parents following the untimely death of his older brother. And yet, here sits Usami, perhaps the most crazed among the 7th Division dogs, roughhousing with his cute younger brother, sharing things about his life with his sister and parents, who also seem to have a good relationship with each other. This is important when compared to characters like Ogata, who posits that children who grow up raised by parents lacking love are going to grow up messed up. Usami's existence undermines this theory if his parents loved each other and he still grew up messed up despite that. Up to a certain point, Usami himself seems pretty well adjusted, easygoing, dare I say, happy. I've seen a lot of fans make claims that the wild part about Usami is that he had a normal upbringing, so it seems like he lacks any justifiable reason for being the way he is. I think fans coming to this conclusion are partially correct. This depiction of a happy childhood is very important, especially when comparing Usami to Ogata. However, much like everything else in Golden Kamuy, there is more to it than meets the eye. And honestly, some of the stuff isn't even buried that deeply by the time we get to the confrontation between Usami and Tsurumi after Usami brutally curb stomps his best friend. The first hints that Usami also faced hardship as a child can be seen as he spends some time alone with Tsurumi. He shows Tsurumi the water wheel, presumably an activity he himself is familiar with, further highlighted by the fact that Tsurumi specifically notes what a good leg exercise this activity is. We see more hints as Usami laments that he will probably have to quit going to the dojo where he trains, because he will have to help his father in the fields. The dojo is the one area of his life that he seemingly has for himself and where he really excels in his skills. But no, Usami is not dramatic or emo as he explains these facts of life, so one might miss how sad it actually is. Usami is still a kid at this point in time, and in a house full of other kids and responsibility that surpass his age, his boyish woes fall to the wayside as unimportant. Tsurumi is the one that insists Usami should keep training, and the idea that Usami should continue, expressed by a man he deeply admires, means a lot to this kid who has very little going for him in his life, and this is later confirmed in the climax of this arc. In general, the fact that Tsurumi recognizes Usami's skill is one that is emphasized repeatedly. Usami brags to his family that Tsurumi says he's the best. Tsurumi later enforces that he believes Usami will one day surpass even him in skill. The best parts of Usami's life seem to revolve around Tsurumi. He shows excitement knowing Tsurumi will be training at the dojo, and he is very obviously disappointed to hear that Tsurumi will be leaving to go to war soon. By the time we get to the dramatic climax where Usami has killed his best friend in front of Tsurumi, we finally see the extent of Usami's repressed emotions. His feelings of desperation and impressions of low self-worth all bubble to the surface in this previously seemingly patient, confident, and easygoing kid. As Usami explains why he killed Tomoharu, he demonstrates that he is rather clever, having known all along that Tsurumi's primary interest was not in him or his skill, but rather his peer, the son of the prestigious military man in town. Tsurumi, as he is prone to, was on the hunt for promising young men destined for a military career with deep pocket connections and high-ranking fathers that he would be able to use to his benefit in the future. Usami explains that he knew all along, and he knew that Tomoharu would be the one to have a close relationship with Tsurumi in the future, not Usami, the son of a poor farmer with no greater prospects or connections. Clearly it all weighed on him over time, but the straw that broke that camel's back was the fact that Tsurumi had implied Tomoharu might be able to surpass Usami's skill in fighting one day. The only thing this young farmer's son had going for him was the fact that Tsurumi saw any level of worth in his skills. "You said I was number one. You acknowledged me. That was everything to me." The distressed Usami shouts these words at the peak of this confrontation, and the idea that this too is going to be taken away from him one day breaks him so thoroughly he commits this act of rash, impulsive violence. When Tsurumi recovers from his shock, acting fast and covering up his own blunder, Usami deflates almost immediately when Tsurumi comforts him with a hug and tells him he'd merely been telling Tomoharu whatever it took to get him to leave the dojo, and that Usami was still number one in his eyes. The tension burst and then disappeared. This immediate forgiveness after such an intense emotional outburst has always been very interesting to me, and I believe it also ties into the unfinished business trope I brought up earlier. When Usami receives what he deems a satisfactory relief from his frustrations, he does not hold a grudge and he reverts to his outwardly happy-go-lucky state. Beyond that, whether or not Tsurumi told the truth about trying to get rid of Tomoharu, it doesn't change the fact that it was all very likely improv on Tsurumi's part. Understanding that it was too late to save Tomoharu, sensing potential in Usami, and making the best out of a bad situation, Tsurumi is quick enough to calculate that no matter what happens now, he's lost his chances with Tomoharu's father, but he can still collect a dangerously loyal killing machine as a subject. Helping Usami cover up the murder further cements Usami's passionate faith in Tsurumi. They are partners in crime, sharing a naughty secret, and the mental link of his prepubescent crush on Tsurumi and his first murder cements the moment and place as a holy one in Usami's mind, referring to it as the place where he lost his virginity, perhaps finally explaining why sexuality and violence is so tightly related for Usami. Which also brings me to the whole point I've been leading up to with this part of the analysis. The nature of the relationship between Usami and Tsurumi is disbalanced for several reasons but mostly because this all goes on while Usami is a child. The Tsurumi jokes are never few or far between in the Golden Kamuy fandom, given the way Tsurumi meets and manipulates so many impressionable young men over the course of events, deliberately using sexuality and flirtations to ensnare them. But in the scope of Tsurumi's many victims, Usami isn't always granted the same sympathies by fans looking for tokens of redemption in the 7th Division characters. In this scene, Usami daydreams wistfully about how much he wants Tsurumi to use him to fulfill his sinister agenda, the way he uses other less self-aware members of the division. Tsurumi tries to lie and say he's not manipulating anyone, and Usami very easily brushes him off, turning it into another joke. He's not mad and totally into it by all observations. So can this sneaky and insolent murderer possibly be a victim of grooming when he's so willing? I think absolutely. And not only that, Usami's case is one of the most textbook examples of grooming on a technical level. If you break down Usami's backstory to bare-bone facts without reader bias, what you're left with is an under-supervised 12-year-old getting sought out by a charming and respected adult in the community. Common social boundaries are then broken as they refer to each other by their first names, implying a very strange level of intimacy between child and adult, until a major event occurs that said child mentally links with his own sexuality, and this event henceforth is thought of as a secret shared between them. I'll go ahead and state now that while nothing explicit ever happens between Tsurumi and his targets, also his goals are those of a military recruiter, not a child predator, I want to reiterate that this is a fictional story, and not everything has to be depicted explicitly for the themes to carry the same weight. As such, my conclusion is, Tsurumi did prey on Usami. The idea that Usami wanted Tsurumi to groom him doesn't sit right with me, because Usami was very young at the time. That plus his lower standing in life made him somewhat desperate to feel special. A more responsible adult figure would not encourage this unstable child with close physical contact and verbal flirtations, nor would they take advantage of this pathological violence as a tool for war. Therefore, my argument is that Tsurumi played a huge contribution to the perverted, bloodthirsty monster Usami grows into as an adult, and perhaps things might have gone differently had there not been a Tsurumi in Usami's life. So that covers our guy. I really wasn't expecting this analysis to end up as long as it did. I hope seeing Usami through my lens has helped you come to some new conclusions, whatever they may be. And before you block me for creeping on the creep, don't forget, it's healthy to listen to opinions that you might disagree with. Otherwise, you could end up like Ogata. Does the pervert trope hold any weight in anime? I suppose the answer remains subjective. But at least in the case of Usami, I like to think it brought a lot of complicated but compelling psychology to the table, making for a super interesting character and storyline. As always, thank you so much to everyone who supported me in this process, and thank you for watching my analysis.